Good morning, everyone. We're going to begin in about 5 minutes. So if everyone can start to take their seats, please. We're going to begin in about 5 minutes. Thank you. There's going to be people speaking up here. Yes, yeah. So we do have a panel, but then we also have the podium as well. You don't want to see really? The video camera? You try to be incognito, and it's like, what? look like I'm speaking over top of your head. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Katie Rosenberger. I'm the Executive Director of Amsa, and I'm very pleased to welcome Wade Grant, who's going to begin our symposium for us today.
Well, thank you very much, Katie. As was stated, my English name is Wade Grant. Actually, it's Howard Wade Grant. I'm named after my father. My traditional name is Salakwalano, and I am the son of Wendy John Taktanot and Howard Grant Kayapalano from the Musqueam Nation, whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory we stand on, along with the Squamish and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I bring greetings from my community, and I bring welcome as my community, my family, my elders, and my ancestors have done since time immemorial. As we stand near the shores of English Bay, as it's called now, and a few hundred meters away from the mouth of the Fraser River, where my great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers welcomed Captain Narvaez, the very first European explorer, to what is now called the city of Vancouver. I stand here and welcome you as their great-great-great-great-great-grandson, welcome you in the same way, in love and peace. It always makes me proud to stand here in front of so many people, in such a diverse audience, because as I was growing up, I always questioned myself of who I was and where I came from. As you may or may not know, I'm not 100% Musqueam. I'm a quarter Chinese and a quarter Norwegian. And for me, it always struggled and tried to tug at myself, like, who am I really? Am I Musqueam? Am I Chinese? Am I Norwegian? Am I Canadian? So for a long time, I always tried to place myself in a hole. And I realized that I don't have to. You know, I should be proud of who I am. I should be proud of where I come from. I should be proud of the thousands of years of unceded rights to this land, but I should also be proud of my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, Hong Man Hing, Hong Tim Hing, who came over in the 1920s, paid the head tax, wanted to find a better life, wanted to create new opportunities for him and his family back in China. But of course, as he got here, he realized that he wasn't going to be treated as a first-class citizen. He was treated as a third-class citizen, just like my grandmother was. So the only place that he was able to find that he was welcome was the Musqueam Nation. And he met a beautiful young woman named Agnes, and they had 4 children together, Gordon, Helen, Larry, and Howard. And it's those intertwining relationships that have now created such a great fabric that is Canada. We see so many cultures, so many backgrounds, so many languages coming here. And for me, I want to embrace those. I'm a quarter Chinese, quarter Norwegian, and Musqueam, but I have a Scottish last name. And for my kids, I don't want them to ever question who they are. I want them to be proud Canadians who also happen to be Chinese, Norwegian, Cree, Scottish, English. That's why we need to embrace one another. We need to embrace what we call reconciliation these days. But for us, for me, I don't always think reconciliation is about looking back and fixing what had happened. For me, the more important part of reconciliation is looking to the future, preparing ourselves for what Canada can and should be. And I look around this table, and I look around at each and every one of you as people that are going to be trailblazers so that my son, Eli, and my daughter, Isla, can grow up being proud of being Canadian, Musqueam, Scottish, Norwegian, Chinese, and Cree. And I thank each and every one of you for taking that time here today so that they can grow up in a really great country. Haitsapkasiyamasaya.
Good morning. Not easy to follow Wade, such a dynamic speaker and person. My name is Baldwin Wong. I'm a social planner with the City of Vancouver. I bring greetings from the city, also together with other city staff, including Caitlin Crabtree, Nadia Cavallo, and Ellen Chant today, on this very important discussion today on building relations between Indigenous and newcomer communities. I would also like to, of course, to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and we thank our local nations, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, for their generosity and hospitality in providing us with the space in which we live, work, and build vibrant communities. Between 2010 and 2013, with support from the province, the city and community partners, some of whom are present today, convened a project called the Dialogues between First Nations, urban Aboriginal, and immigrant communities in Vancouver. The project aimed to increase understanding and strengthen relations among the city's Indigenous and newcomer non-Indigenous communities. As far as we know, this is the first project in BC, if not Canada, that focused on relationship building between Indigenous and immigrant communities. We were fortunate to have the support of our local First Nations, and we also reach out to our urban Indigenous partner organizations. And immigrant settlement agencies have a strong representation in the project as well. The project was chaired by 3 people. You just actually heard from one of the chairs, which is Mr. Wade Grant, who represented the Musqueam people on the project steering committee. Susan Tatouche from the Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Center was the other co-chair, as well as Professor Henry Yu from UBC. More than 5,000 people contributed or participated in the process, which included the establishment of 12 dialogue circles that engage people from Indigenous and non-Indigenous backgrounds for exchanges about the experiences and perspectives, 15 cultural exchange visits, including visits to our local First Nations, Elder and Youth Project, a web survey that had received over 1,500 responses, a literature scan, and interviews with key members of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders, which are later included and published in the Vancouver Dialogues book. In 2013, as part of this project, we convened a summit inviting Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth to participate. Actually, I recognize some faces here who actually participate in that summit. In fact, the summit was also held at this very place, which is the WAS Center, with 120 youth participating over 2 days. It was remarkable for me to remember the energy, passion, and commitment from all the youth to talk about building solidarity among communities and their vision for the future. To continue advance this work in 2013, with support from Cory Wilson, whom you will hear from later, and partners such as the Vancouver Public Library, the city published the First Peoples, A Guide for Newcomers. This document is posted on the city website in case you want to find out more. The guide aims to fill the need for providing clear and in simple language information about the First Peoples in Vancouver. It introduces newcomers to learning more about the history, culture, and concerns for First Peoples in Vancouver and beyond. In 2018, in continuing in the same spirit as the Dialogues Project, we engaged with Bcit and Amsa to look at creating more opportunities for non-Indigenous groups and leaders to come together to meet and learn from Indigenous communities and leaders. Earlier this year, the city sponsored cultural visits to local First Nations by inviting members of the Vancouver Immigration Partnership project to participate. The visits and learning have been tremendous so far. In fact, the visits took place with the support of key Indigenous leaders such as Mr. Wade Grant. To conclude, we'd like to congratulate Amsa for organizing this important symposium to further engage leadership from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities on building stronger relations and understanding among communities. As a city of reconciliation, we look forward to learning from your discussions today and to ensure that the city is a welcoming and inclusive place for all. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cory Wilson. I'm the Executive Director, Indigenous Initiatives and Partnerships at Bcit, and I'd like to thank Wade for the welcome and thank the Coast Salish people who, Wade might have some comments on this, but I've actually lived at Musqueam for over 20 years, and he still lets me live there, which is great. So I'm honored to live, work, and play on the territory of the Coast Salish people. I'm Kwakwaka'wakw from Northern Vancouver Island, and I'm really honored to be here, and I'm really pleased to see so many of you here today. This has been, as Baldwin indicated, a project that started probably a good, well, I guess the Olympics kind of really started it all off and then has continued for the last 19 years and hopefully will continue until everybody has a clear understanding of Indigenous people and our place in space within Canada. From BCIT's perspective, we were happy, of course, to partner with the City of Vancouver and with Amsa to promote and extend and expand what we've already done in terms of reaching out to newcomers and to immigrants in this country, or in British Columbia in particular. And I have to say, Baldwin, I just got back last week from working with the Lebanese and Arab Social Services Society, I believe it's called, in Ottawa, and they are nowhere near where, in Ottawa, they're nowhere near where we are, as well as Calgary and various other cities. The only city I know right now, yes, it's a yay for us. There was a cheer over there. The city of Prince George, I know hopefully by the fall will be launching their own guide, which will be the second guide in this country. And somebody just mentioned the city of Burnaby as well, so that's fantastic. People often say, well, how or why would a post-secondary get involved in something like this? I'm not even the head of international or the head of student services or anything like that. I think it's just absolutely vital that education is the key. There's no greater weapon to change the world, absolutely. Newcomers and immigrants that come to this country are choosing it. Of course, I recognize there are reasons people leave that aren't necessarily by choice, but people are coming to Canada, choosing to make this country their home, are committing to Canada, and Canada is stronger. The number of voices, with every voice is included, and if every voice is at the table. And I was talking to somebody last week, and they talk about diversity as a reality. It's a reality in this country, but inclusion is a choice. So we all have a choice to make inclusion, to choose inclusion over exclusion, and to make sure that we ensure that there is truth in the process of reconciliation. And part of reconciliation is understanding the truth about Indigenous people in this country, about the place and space of our history today. And reconciliation isn't just about overcoming the legacy of residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission highlighted residential schools. Absolutely, that is a horrific part of our history. But the truth also is that we still live with the legacy of colonization today in this country. I still have a card in my wallet. I know Wade has a card in his wallet. My number is 623-400-501. So we all still have these issues and this legacy of colonization that still exists. Each and every one of us in this room have an obligation, I believe, to learn more from an Indigenous perspective, to share what we can with newcomers and immigrants, as well as everybody who is non-Indigenous, to learn and to understand the truth about Indigenous people, recognize their own privilege, recognize your own unconscious bias, and work towards a greater country, a better country that will be stronger if all Canadians are included and all voices are heard. And I hope today we can have those open dialogue sessions, and that this becomes, we often talk a lot about safe spaces. Safe spaces are where you're not going to be threatened if you say something, where you can just say what you want to say. But what we really need to start creating are brave spaces, and I hope this is a brave space where people are comfortable to say what they want to say and are really willing to listen to what is said, and we move towards truth, and then we can begin with reconciliation. And I'm often asked, when will the process of reconciliation end in Canada? Well, it's not going to end. There's always going to be stuff we have to reconcile. You know, if you want to put it in statistics, until Indigenous people are no longer at the negative end of every socioeconomic indicator, reconciliation will not end. Until every Indigenous person, every newcomer to Canada has this equal opportunities, we no longer need to have equity because we are achieving at the same rate. Till I'm out of a job, ideally it'd be great if I was out of a job at BCIT, because that would mean Indigenous people are achieving at BCIT at the same rate or exceeding that of non-Indigenous people, as well as all our programs and services are culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive to the needs of Indigenous people. And that our partnerships are actually, which we do, don't get me wrong, we are doing a lot of great work at BCIT, but the idea being that these things are no longer needed because we are all achieving what we need to achieve to make this country a great country and a place where everybody has a voice. So I hope you enjoyed today's session. I hope you come with your brave questions and your brave souls, and that we can begin this dialogue and ensure and keep advancing the relationship between Indigenous people and newcomers in this country. And I believe Katie is up next.
Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today as we engage in meaningful but also challenging dialogue. I would like to acknowledge the inherent privilege that I have received by working on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and by living on the unceded ancestral territory of the Semiahmoo First Nation. I acknowledge that my children and I have thrived on these territories and commit to searching for my own accountability to this land and its true stewards for thousands of years before I called it my home. I would like to acknowledge and thank our partners on this project, the City of Vancouver's Immigration Partnership and Bcit. As well, Canadian Heritage has been an amazing funder and partner, and I thank them for funding today's event. On Wednesday, I had the privilege of hearing Elder Larry Grant of the Musqueam First Nation speak to a group of graduate students at UBC. He came into the room, he sat down, and for almost 3 hours, captivated the group with his stories of the history of this land. At the end of the talk, he said to us that if he can change one person's mind every time he talks to a group, then he has succeeded. And as I was reflecting on his words, I thought about my own experience and how I have come to find myself here today. The daughter of white British immigrants, the mother of 2 little girls, the executive director of Amsa. Who am I on this land? How did I come to receive the privilege and so-called rights that I have? How will I pass these on to my daughters? How am I running my organization? How did I get here, and at what cost? At whose expense? If I have this privilege, where did it come from, and why has it inherently come to me? But more importantly, and probably most importantly, how has it contributed to the individual and collective experiences of Indigenous people today? This forum is about hearing stories, ideas, perspectives. We have people here today that are giving their time, but more importantly, their hearts and their minds, so that we can hear about their experience. They will speak their truth, and so will I. I have had pain in my life. I have had every privilege given to me to cope with that pain. Medical professionals that provide medicine and treatment based on my cultural norms. Psychological counseling that is rooted in my Anglo-settler version of the world. Access to education in the most beautiful place I have ever been, on land that was not ours to occupy. So I wonder if the things I am saying are impacting you in a certain way right now. Am I making people feel uncomfortable? I certainly was when I first explored these questions. Elder Larry Grant spoke of changing one mind. Mine was changed the day I had this discussion with a man named Javier, and you will have the opportunity to hear from him soon. He made me think about my accountability in a way that I had never thought of before, and it made me uncomfortable, and it made me a little defensive. But as I stepped back and listened to his incredible experiences of living and working in many places around the world, I began to reflect. I began to listen, and I have not stopped listening and reflecting ever since. As an organization, Amsa has grappled with these issues for years. We've gone back and forth about territorial acknowledgements at events, whether we include a message in our email signatures that acknowledges the territory that our office is on, and if we do those things, what do they mean, and why do we do them? Are we checking a box, paying lip service, and then going on about our day? As an organization, particularly an organization that exists because of migration to unceded ancestral lands that are not ours to invite people to, how do I navigate this complexity? You will notice that I seem to have a great deal of questions, and so far haven't given you a single answer. Well, that is because we are still figuring out what we don't know. And before we can recognize what we do know and mindfully take steps to decolonize ourselves and our workplaces, we need to investigate what are the questions first, and then the answers. I hope that you will work with us today to engage in this process. You will first have the amazing experience of doing what I did on Wednesday and listening, just listening. There is so much power in being able to listen, to reflect, and to experience the words without preparing for your own question or comment. Once the panel discussion is over, we will then gather downstairs for a light meal and have the opportunity to communicate with each other, sharing our thoughts about what we have heard, how it makes us feel, and what we need to do going forward to mindfully understand our role on these lands and the consequences of our actions, whether intended or otherwise. We will create, as Cory says, a brave space. As the Executive Director of Amsa, I commit to engaging in this process in the following ways. Understanding and feeling my experience in this land in relation to Indigenous presence, so I can, for example, center my acknowledgements in reality. Understanding the shared history I have with the original inhabitants of this land and the consequences that have ironically put me in a more favorable spot than those who have been here since time immemorial. Understanding that even when I feel, well, it was not me, or, well, this happened hundreds of years ago, and similar phrases that we all hear, there are certainly things such as collective harm, collective privilege, and collective trauma, which I'm a part of today, all stemming from the same place. Understanding that it is necessary that I do my work in building my accountability to this land as a white woman, as a leader of an organization in the immigration sector in Canada, and with all the complexities that come with that. Elder Roberta Price is going to help us do that, to center Indigenous presence in our experience as non-Indigenous and settlers in the unceded territories, so we can have that place to start. Please join me in giving the warmest of welcomes and show our gratitude to Elder Roberta Price.
Haichka Siem Siaya, greetings and welcome everyone. As Coast Salish matriarch and elder, I wish to give a warm thanks to all my relatives on the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh for welcoming me to live in the unceded lands of my relatives, the Musqueam and Richmond, for 40 years now. As Coast Salish matriarch and elder, I wish to give each and every one of you a warm welcome who live, work, and play and visit in our unceded, ancestral, and occupied lands of my relatives, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roberta Price. My heritage is I am Coast Salish. I am Snuneymuxw on my dad's side, and that's where I was born. When they came to our lands, they couldn't say our names. They couldn't say our language. So perhaps when they couldn't say Snuneymuxw, they called it Nanaimo. So I was born there right on the #1 reserve, right on the waterfront in Nanaimo. And I am Cowichan on my mom's side. The dialect of the language of my people is taught to me by my elders on this side of the water, up there in the Stalo territory, the Chilliwack area. The language of my people is called the Halkomelem language. I knew and understood and spoke my language fluently until I was 6 years old. Beyond 6 years old, I was not allowed to have anything to do with my language, my heritage, and my culture. And I was actually tortured about that. I have spent well over 40 years reclaiming back my identity, searching out for my family, and especially searching for my mother. Very, very pleased and proud to finally find my mom when I became a grandmom in 1994. I was able to spend 8 years with my mother before she passed away. My mother affirming all the teachings of all the elders that I work with leading up to my mom. She'd say, yep, That's the way we do that cultural teaching. Yep, that's the way we do that ceremony. And I share with you that due to those horrific experiences from age 6 onwards, for many, many, many years, I used the contemporary Western method of healing, counseling in psychiatry and psychology. But I really felt the greatest part of my healing journey came. I call this dear lady a friend today. She'll be 84 this year. My dear friend Flo was my boss in the early 80s. My dear friend Flo spent her entire life in the residential school. My dear friend Flo was also helper to the elders. She knew what I needed. She brought me to those elders. Those elders, they took me under their wing. They taught me. They guided me. They prayed for me. But mostly importantly of all, what those elders did for me is they loved me. They loved me unconditionally. Unconditionally. Because when you are ripped away from your family, age 3, 4, 5, 6, and older, what you are missing is that unconditional love you receive from your parents, your grandparents, your family, your nation, your community. That unconditional love. They gave it to me lovingly. They gave it to me openly. Never ever did I dream for one moment at that time that close to 40 years later, I would be walking in their footsteps today, sharing that same unconditional love with so many in so many communities. We still need it. We still need it very, very much. I hold my hands up in thanks to those elders. I say thanks in my prayers each and every morning. I want to share with you that I've been elder at BC Women and Children's Hospital for 7 years and counting. Elder with the Vancouver Coastal Health Aboriginal Patient Navigator Program, going into all the other hospitals within Vancouver Coastal Health. Elder with Providence Healthcare, so Mount St. Paul's and Mount St. Joe's. Many, many times I am called to the mental wellness ward. I share a little bit of my journey with the patients. I go in there to lift the spirit, lift the emotion, get a connection with them. Sometimes I do have that connection. Sometimes I do have a smile. Sometimes I do have a little bit of a chuckle. When I say with them, hey, Elder Roberta was a pretty hard nut to crack. Close to 30 elders that I work with in my journey. And not one of them ever gave up on me. Not once. Just like I'm not going to give up on you. So I hold my hands up to those elders from many, many nations, from right across Canada, who lived here in BC, who guided, cared, and loved me unconditionally, and sent those prayers up for not just me, but many, many others. So I want to share some teachings of some beautiful elders that I work with for many, many years. Then I'm going to call you each out of your comfort zone to join me in those teachings this morning before I carry on. I work with my dear, dear mentor, elder teacher, Elder Vince Stogan from the Musqueam. I work with his children, Elders Art and Thelma. Today we're like brother and sisters. We didn't know each other 40 years ago when I worked with their dad, but we know each other well today. We help each other, help the community. Elder Bob George from the Tsleil-Waututh over on the North Shore. Many, many years I work with Elder Vince and Elder Bob amongst the beautiful 30 elders that I had the grace to work with. Elder Vince, Elder Bob, and many of us elders, we always share that teaching that whenever we come together, we must share a blessing and a prayer for our time together. What that blessing and the prayer does, it covers our thoughts, it covers our words, it covers our interactions together. In that blessing and the prayer, I'll share the teachings first, and then I'll call you each out of your comfort zone to stand and join me. Elder Vince's teachings are that when we're in that blessing and the prayer, what we do is we join hands. And when we join those hands, what we do is we put our left palm upwards to our person on our left. That left palm up is to Father Sky. We put our right palm down to our person on our right. That right palm down is to Mother Earth. Elder Vince's other teachings are that our left palm up is to our ancestors. We're calling upon and calling down in the prayers to be amongst us as we work, play, interact. Our right palm down is to our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. When we join hands in that way, we're keeping those connections very, very strong. So I'll call you each up to stand up now. Move over and join with your friends, with your neighbors. And so I have to share with you, when I met my elders, I was a bit confused. Sometimes didn't know my right from my left. So our left palm is upwards to our person on our left. Our right palm is down to our person on our right. Did I say that right? Okay. So our left palm is up and our right palm is down. So our left palm is up to Father Sky, right palm down to Mother Earth. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Haichka. Haichka Osiam, Osiam. We call upon you, Creator, to bring your many, many blessings down upon this very special event here today. We call upon you, Creator, to bless anyone who's away due to illness or other obligations. Bless anyone yet to come. Help them to arrive safely. We call upon you, Creator, to bring your blessings down upon our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our spirits. So when we think our thoughts, they are good, positive, and respectful. When we speak our words, they are good, positive, and respectful. And we call upon you, Creator, to bless the people who have prepared the food, bless the food and drink we put in to nourish our bodies on our journeys to wellness and strength. And we call upon you, Creator, to bless all the shared teachings, all the shared learnings, all the shared interactions that will go on in our circle today. And we call upon you, Creator, and respectfully ask you to cover us each with your warm blanket of protection as we journey through our professional lives, our family lives, and our lives in general. We give you many, many thanks, Creator, as we always ask you to bring all of your blessings down upon the hurting, the hungry, and the homeless, and especially the hurting, Creator. Haichka, Haichka Osiam, Osiam. Thank you so much, everyone. You can sit down now. Osiam. Yeah, you can clap if you want. Osiam, Osiam. Thank you so kindly. So I want to share, too, that ceremony guided each and every step of each and every day of our lives as taught to me by my elders. And I have in my hand these cedar boughs as taught to me by my elders. We would pick those cedar boughs each and every morning. We would go into that cold, cold water. What we are doing is ceremony. We are brushing every single part of our bodies off with those cedar boughs. What we are doing is a cleansing. We are pushing all the negative and evil energy off of us so we can go about our day in a good and respectful way. I've been going into classrooms here in the Lower Mainland for 33 years now, talking about First Nations. I'll share the exercise with each and every one of you this morning that I share with those little ones right from preschool up into university, to share with you the meaning of negative energy, and I'll ask you each to participate with me. Raise your hand, folks, if you've ever felt a cranky moment in your life. Feel free to raise too. That, my dear friends, is the meaning of negative energy. Can you do things really well when you are cranky? Maybe extra hard, maybe extra fast, but not really well. So brushing all that negative energy off of you in that cold water each and every morning will help you go about your day in a good and respectful way. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the teachings that my elders guided me to. I want to share with you that I am a mother of 4 and a grandmother to 8. My oldest grandson will be 25 in August, and him and his girl have been together for quite some years now. They told me after Christmas they want to get married. So I'm just wondering why. So maybe I'll catch up to some of my elders that I lead in the circle at the end of every month and be a great grandma soon. And his little baby sister, my little Cheyenne, Roberta Price, is 4 years old. So I do the work that I do in the communities and the schools so that their lives can be better. It started when my son was born, and now he's in his mid-40s, and I'm still doing the work. So I'm very, very pleased to come and be a part of your day here today. I want to share with you, I'll share with you an experience, kind of a reflection about one of the journeys in my life. And I want to share with you, like I said, I looked for my mom all my life, and I found her when I became a grandmom. When I met my mom, I did not know that my mom was the mother of 12 children. The Indian agent came and took 8 of my mom's 12 children and put them into Cooper Island Residential School. And you know, my sister and I were grabbed on the way home from school, just probably from about here to the end of these round, just from not too far. We were grabbed by 2 social workers before we reached the reserve. In 2011, 2012, I signed on to Klein Lawyers when they were going to do a class action lawsuit against the government. And then when the government decided to do what they did, Klein sent me back all the papers for me to actually sign and send to whatever group it is. And I received that on the last day of the year. So December 31st, I received that. And I looked through those papers, and it was a little bit of a splash of cold water on me when I saw that it was the Indian agent, First Nanaimo, that facilitated those 2 social workers to intercept me and my sister before they reached the reserve land. Because many of you may or may not know that what the government termed as reserves, lands reserved for Indians, and Indians are a federal jurisdiction under their words. So that is federal, the reserves are federal, and under the transfers from the government, Ministry of Health, Social Services, and Education are provincial jurisdictions. So you know those jurisdictions didn't cross for quite a long time. Those social workers couldn't come on to the reserve, and they wouldn't dare come on Snuneymuxw to grab our children. So the Indian agent facilitated that interception between me and my sister and our reaching our reserve land. And we were sitting in that office, and quite some time later, we were 8, 6, and then our 4-year-old sister joined us. Let me tell you, my dad would have come looking for us because we didn't get home from school. And I'm sure he would have been arrested because they had my younger sister. And then we got really, really scared. We kept saying, we want to go home, we want to go home. And then we started crying. And those social workers said, girls, stop crying. You're going to go home real soon. And you know what? We never, ever went home again. And you know, I was very, very, very upset when I grew up and I found out why we were warehoused in that foster home. 3 to 4 to a bed is because the foster parents got double the money for each and every one of us Indigenous children that they took in. So they took in piles of us, and than they did for any child from the larger society. And it was a big shock that I saw in the court documents that Klein lawyers sent to me on December 31st that it was also, because I've spoken quite a bit about the Indian agent taking my 8 siblings away from my mother, and then realizing that the Indian agent took all my children away, all her children away, all 12 of us. So I want to share with you an experience. If any of you were here in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when it came around here to Vancouver, at that time I was elder leader in a course for the Aboriginal Tourism Program for the Native Education College. I was leading the course Heritage Repatriation and Cultural Interpretation. And all the students, we had planned a field trip to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you know, the day that it happened, many of the students were overcome. They couldn't go to that day. Only 2 students decided to go. And I said, okay, and I arranged with another instructor to take care of the class. And I took the 2 students, we traveled to the P&E grounds. And in the morning, it was the big event in the Coliseum. And it was quite an event. Like, you could really feel the heaviness of the energy in that building. But you know, when the elders came up on stage and then they started talking, I could see all that heavy energy lifting and going up with their kind words, with their humorous words, with their blessings. And then they said, you know, next door, the event ended around close to noon, and they said, you know, next door in the Aggregate Dome where they're selling all the books and other items or giving away items, in the bottom there is all the churches. If you were affected by the residential school from one of those churches, you have a right to go and ask for a representative to sit with you and listen to you. And when you're finished, they will stand up and apologize to you on behalf of the church. The male student, he went to be with his family because his whole family was there, and the female student stayed with me. And her family affected by the Catholic Church in the north, my family affected by the Catholic Church on Cooper Island Residential School. And so we asked for the Catholic Church. We had a nun come out. She was in her late 80s. And we asked her, can we just do what, lead it? And she said, it was very agreeable. Yes, you can do what you want. And as we each shared our story, our journey, she kept asking us questions and then kept apologizing, saying, oh, I'm not supposed to speak. I'm not supposed to interrupt you. And we kept saying, oh, that's okay, that's okay. And when we finished, this younger woman and myself joined hands, and we waited for this nun to stand up and apologize. This nun stood up, and she said, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And then she burst into tears, and she said, but I wasn't there. I didn't do this to your children. I didn't do this. Do you think that is what we wanted to hear? We just held each other's hands. I had to go on to the hospital after that, and she was okay to get home. And we went, and I felt so much anger. I thought, never going there again. Not going to go there. And I was participating in a research study in the downtown east side, and we would meet at lunchtime this happened, I believe, on a Wednesday, so every Thursday we'd meet at lunchtime. And I think, okay, I can sleep in tomorrow. Then I can just make it by my lunchtime meeting. Well, our ancestors and the Creator guide us and take good care of us. Guess what happened to Elder Roberta? I got up very, very early. I got ready. My car took me to the P&E. I had no idea. It was like I was in a trance, I was in a dream. And I'm thinking, what am I doing here? What am I doing here? I got out of the car and I found myself in front of this big white tent. And they had volunteers all over the grounds, making sure everybody's okay. This young woman said, so are you here for the statement? And I said, what is this about anyway? And then she says, well, why don't you come in? We have elders and folks in here. We have tea. And then she brought me to a Cree elder, and we sat and had some tea. And I was able to share with the Cree elder my experience of the day before. Just as I listen and comfort and silence with others, this elder did the same for me. And then she said, well, actually, Roberta, this is the tent where they give statements to the federal government for the families that were affected by the residential schools. And would you like to do that? Originally, I had no intentions of doing that. And I said, well, yes, I guess I can. And she said, you can have it written, you can have it recorded, you can have it video recorded. And I said, okay, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to video record it. So I filled out all the papers, went up into the special area where they had the cameras and the seating. And behind the camera was a Métis woman. So, you know, I felt very, very supported, very, very safe. And I started my statement. And I looked into that camera and I said to the federal government, what was different that happened in the residential schools that happened in the foster homes? The reason why I share that? Today I stand before you with 22 mended bones in my body. I stand before you with hundreds of stitches closing the wounds put on my body. I didn't know that my statement was going to last 3.5 hours. So these lovely, lovely ladies, the lady behind the camera said, are you finished now, Roberta? And I said, yes, I think I am. So she started to turn off the lights and something, I think it was my ancestors, my siblings. I said, no, actually I'm not finished. Turn the camera back on. She turned it back on and I looked right into that camera. And I want to share with you the day that Stephen Harper did the apology. I never ever saw it till last year at a pro-day school last year. I stayed home from work. I got tea and stuff for my sister and I. We turned the TV on. When it started, we both were so overcome, turned the TV off and never, ever watched it. We couldn't watch it. And I looked into that camera. And I said to the federal government, you need to keep saying sorry. Sorry. Sorry till you actually mean it. Till you don't just tell Canada and the USA, but you tell the entire world what you did to our children in this country. You need to keep saying sorry. I said, now you can turn the camera off. I also want to share with you that due to the residential schools and the foster care system, my sister and I have buried 8 of our siblings. Who I hold to account. Who I hold to account for what happened to 5 generations of my family. It's not everybody walking down the street. Not everybody walking down the street who I hold to account for what happened to 5 generations of my family is the federal government. The federal government and its laws and its policies that are entrenched in the Constitution. Nowhere in this world does a country have entrenched in its Constitution to make not just one generation, but many generations made to feel that we are inferior. No way. I want to call upon the lovely lady who just spoke before me. The executive director, did she have to leave? Can you come up here, please? In this era that they call truth and reconciliation, many of us elders believe and teach out there. That is important. Important for every single one of us in this country we call Canada to heal together over what I just spoke of. I'll share an example with you. Katie's great-grandmother and my great-grandmother were neighbors. Katie's great-grandmother and my great-grandmother had 10 children each. The federal government, the RCMP, the Indian agent came and took my great-grandmother's 10 children away from her. Didn't touch Katie's. Katie's great-grandmother and my great-grandmother loved each other very, very much. They were good friends. Don't you think that Katie's great-grandmother's heart would have hurt just as much as my great-grandmother's heart? This is why I share it's important for each and every one of us to heal together, to join hands, just like I shared in the prayers, to join hands, work together, heal together in this era that they call truth and reconciliation. Thank you, Katie. Hi, HKCM, everyone, for listening to just a little bit of my one family, but it means thousands and thousands and thousands of our families right across this nation. I hold my hands up to my Indigenous brothers and sisters for listening to perhaps what happened in your family, for sure. I want to thank each and every one of you today and hope and know that we do not share our stories to create any kind of guilt. We share our stories to create understanding, to create awareness, to create acceptance of the truth of what happened in this country. We all need to work together as Indigenous and non-Indigenous neighbors in order for this country to heal
from that negative past. Haichka OCM. Thank you, everyone.
So we're now going to move into our panel discussion. Javier is going to be moderating. I encourage you all to take a deep breath. Remember the words of Elder Roberta. Javier, I turn it over to you. So we're going to actually just take a minute.
I don't know where my papers are. Thank you so much, Elder Roberta. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your stories, and for making this place just being prepared for what we are going to talk about, and for letting people understand their experiences in relation to the indigenous presence that's always been here. Thank you so much for accepting being here today. And I can tell you, this is an amazing honor to have you here. Thank you so much. Just a couple of things before we start. We have a last minute regret. One of our panelists, Alan, their organization is opening some new sites, and Alan needs to be part of the ceremonies. So that's very important work. And so Alan sends their regrets. So we'll miss him, but we have still an amazing panel, and I really thank each and one of you for being here. And I would like to start, actually, I just very quickly, we do a lot of acknowledgements and, land acknowledgements, and Katie was talking about, like, sometimes it's just like checking boxes or, like doing a little bit of a lip service. And, we all work, there's mainly people from the sector. We know that there's some people that are outside of the immigration sector, but, we all know that we do kind of a little bit of that, right? Like, we try to find the quick answer to things and the quick, sheet that we can check boxes and feel that we're doing things. So hopefully today we're taking this to a different space, and we can actually talk a bit differently. And we hope that that reflects also in our working branch that will be happening a bit later. So, I mean, for me, in terms of acknowledgements, I also like to, understand and acknowledge the resistance, the generosity, and, the capacity of indigenous people as a collective to actually take us all here today to speak about the topics that we're going to be speaking. So we need to understand that, it is mainly because of that resistance. It is mainly because of that generosity. It is mainly because of that capacity that we are able to speak today and to have, these amazing panelists with us. So what I'm going to do is I just want to introduce one by one, but I won't read their bios. They're all fantastic, and you have, you can read them, and so. But I think that, the people that are here, I will actually invite you to do a little bit of introduction of yourself, if you want, in terms of who you are here today. But I would like to ask you one by one a little bit as a way of introducing you, a little bit about our, some of the individual conversations that we've had, because I think that can frame very well what we're going to speak later, and also for people to know you a little bit. So, Charlene, if you don't mind, I would like to start with you. Yeah, you have to press the button down there, and there will be a...
Check.
Yeah, perfect. So, first of all, thank you so much for being here. We are really honored with your presence. And I wanted to start with you because you shared an amazing story with me, and also you're a storyteller. Oh, so, if you want to introduce yourself a little bit, if you want to go directly to your story, that's fine, whatever you want to do. But, I remember that story that, is about your mom that you shared with me. And, if you're okay with it, I would love for you to share it with people today. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Javier. Oki nexo goa, nitanuko gaku. I greet you all as my relations in the Blackfoot way, and that greeting extends past this room to the ocean, to the rocks, to the rivers, to the trees, to all the animals, to all the insects, to all living beings. Everything is animate in the Blackfoot paradigm. I am from the Siksika Nation, which is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. My mother is a full-blooded Blackfoot woman, a residential school survivor. And my father is from England, a part of England where the Anglo-Saxons drove the Celtics into. So that is my history. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was a very famous person, Bilbo Baggins. No, just kidding. I'm just teasing. It is a great honor to be here with you, everyone. I acknowledge the Elder Roberta in the room. I acknowledge my Indigenous brothers and sisters. I acknowledge all newcomers and all Canadians. So my mother is a residential school survivor. She, when she was 8 years old, her mother tried to keep her home as long as she could, because she knew what it was like. But my mother was very keen to learn, and she would see her peers, she would see everyone getting on this bus and going away for quite a while, and so she wanted to be part of this learning. And because she loved to read books, her mother taught her to read, and so she got stuck onto the bus and became a stowaway and ended up at the residential school, and then soon realized that she couldn't go home. She said that her first meal there was a fish cake, and that she threw it against the wall because the Blackfoot, in our traditional way, very different from the Coast Salish people here, our diet was buffalo. And we didn't eat fish because we had rivers, there were fish, but we believed that in our in our belief system, in our worldview, that the water people were sacred, so we didn't eat fish. So she threw this fish cake against the wall, as a wild Blackfoot she was. No, I'm just kidding. She soon learned the corporal punishment that ensued forth from that, and lived her life that way until she ended up in the TB sanatorium. My mother worked for the government after my father left us, and we were plunged into poverty, and she found a job working at the federal government. She found a job as a junior employment counselor, and she started to support the family that way. Soon, over time, she became an expert in employment and became the Native Employment Specialist. Back in the day, that's what we called it, Native, in the 80s. And soon after that, she was promoted to immigration and became an employment counselor, but she was trained as an actual counselor, not just as an employment counselor. And she was trained in trauma therapy because she was receiving political refugees from other parts of the world. And she would receive people and say, "Welcome to my homelands. Welcome to Blackfoot country. I am a Blackfoot woman and I welcome you." And she would soon work to challenge the stereotypes that people would come over with, because what she found is that people would come over with somehow the idea that Indigenous people here in Canada were lazy, were drunk. These stereotypes that are here in Canada was actually spread out over the world. And so she would have to work to debunk those stereotypes. And she did it modeling herself too. She was a very gracious, very diplomatic, very strong woman. And she worked with political refugees, and she dedicated herself. She would come home and she would have to debrief. She wouldn't share any personal information, but she would say, "I have to tell you that I helped a woman today who had to run from her home, run from her kitchen table, grab her children by the arms, run out the back door, and she ran all the way here to Canada." Of course, going into refugee camps and going through that whole process through UNICEF, but she would receive them. She was the first person they would see, and she would receive them with kindness, and she would help them to settle in Canada. She would help people to mitigate their trauma and to find employment, to find careers that were in line with what they did in their home countries. She wasn't sending people to be janitors. If someone came with an engineering degree, she would make sure that they ended up in the engineering department. She would make sure that people would find a good life here. She would tell me of the terrible things that people endured, and I soon learned that people from all over the country experienced genocidal forces. People from all over the country experience torture. People from all over the country also have their children taken away from them. Some people have to run and leave their families. And this created in me compassion for political refugees, compassion for newcomers. My mother and I would be in the grocery store, and people would approach her, strangers to me, and they would approach her and hold her hands in both of their hands and hold her hand and say, "Thank you, thank you, thank you for helping me." And tears would come, and they would gift my mother, and because she did such amazing work. A Blackfoot woman, a residential school survivor, receiving people from other countries who had suffered because she could relate. It was different manifestations of genocide, but she was able to empathize, and she was able, as a strong Blackfoot woman, hold them up. But one thing that really struck her was this disparity. The disparity of Canada receiving people who were suffering, which is a beautiful thing. That is a beautiful thing. Canada was receiving people who are suffering and helping them, making sure that they have a good life. But then she saw the disparity of her own community and her own experience as a residential school survivor and her own history, historical trauma, the collective trauma of Indigenous people that Canada had imposed on us. So whereas Canada is a refuge for many, many people, and that is a beautiful thing, Canada is also a place of genocidal forces against Indigenous people in our own homeland. So we have become, in many ways, refugees in our own homelands.
Thank you so much,
You're welcome.
Charlene. Vicky, thank you so much for being here. Really honored. And I would like to follow up a little bit that story with your, how do you also present yourself, and how do you identify, and it's in your bio, as a settler here in Canada. Charlene was saying how, how beautiful it is to bring people, but how also the conditions created was that, Indigenous people would end up being refugees in their own country.
Yeah.
You come, as a settler, identify, I know it's a big question, but can you frame a little bit that for the audience? Thank you.
Sure. I really want to thank you, Elder Roberta, for everything you shared. Yeah, it's not the first time I've heard you speak, and it's another layer of you. I really appreciate that. And thanks, Charlene, for sharing that story of your mother and the work that she and I probably do the same work from very different locations at different costs, always acknowledging that. So I'm really honored to be here. I'm pretty humbled. I'm a white settler. All of my grandparents were refugees to this country, or immigrants. It's hard to tell. Canada's a place where people who get to call themselves Canadian don't have to tell the difference between a settler who's an immigrant and a settler who's a refugee, but we know there's a difference. Refugees are required to get sanctuary in other territories. Immigrants chose to come to someone else's territory, so that's all of my people came that way. I'm a white settler, and I have heterosexual and cisgendered privilege, and I have way too much school. I have 27 years of school. I'm an adjunct professor, and I teach psychology, which I think of as psycholinization. And I'm very concerned from inside psychology, the way the apparatus of psychology absolutely parallels colonization. When I think about that, I think about the teachings of Frantz Fanon, who was a black psychiatrist who fought against torture in the Algerian War, who said, the year I was born, he was dead before I was born, but it was published when I was born in The Wretched of the Earth, that we use psychology to psychologize the colonized, when the people who are mentally unwell are the colonizers. And this was said in the 1940s. And in 27 years of psychology, PhD education, I've never had Frantz Fanon referenced. It's because he's a black man and because he was vehemently decolonizing from the get-go. So I want to start with my accountabilities to my profession and my work from inside. That's why I became a professor, to try to dismantle some of that. But as a white settler, I work really hard in my work as a professor, as a psychotherapist, and I've been the former clinical supervisor at VAST. I was the first clinical supervisor at the Center for Survivors of Torture here. I am always trying to come from a justice-doing place and a decolonizing place, but decolonizing is too big a word for me. I think that where I'm at is trying to unsettle myself as a settler. And I'm really informed by Indigenous teachers on that, specifically Eve Tuck, who says when, you know, especially white settlers, we gotta be very careful. If we're gonna say that we're decolonizing, what we're talking about is probably dismantling our nation, which I think is a pretty good project, actually, just speaking for myself. When I want to move from being unsettled, if I ever get to decolonizing, it's about land return and Indigenous governance. And for me, as a direct action activist, to always be led in my actions by Indigenous people. So that's the life of work that I'm on. I just returned from Australia, and I was keynoting a conference on newcomers, immigrants and refugees and survivors of torture and political violence in Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia. While I was there, the massacre of Muslim people in Christchurch happened. And this was horrific and not unexpected by newcomers, refugees, survivors of torture, Muslim people or Aboriginal people. And I was on I guess like the CBC for Australia interviewed me and a couple other key people, I guess, at the conference. And they had this map that, you know, of Canada the Good. So the question they asked me after they talked to people from Aotearoa, New Zealand was, so Canada, there was an outpouring of sympathy in Canada, wasn't there? How did your country respond? And I was required to disavow them of this story of Canada as a place of sympathy for this. And what I was saying is, you know, the Christchurch massacre could have well happened in Canada. It was shocking in New Zealand, it would be shocking in Canada, but not shocking to newcomers, refugees, Muslims, or Indigenous people. The only folks who were shocked were people of privilege who have safe lives. And when I was asked about how we are making repair with survivors of torture in Canada, I was like, you cannot repair genocide and suffering of refugees in these territories that are Indigenous without being accountable for the genocide that happened on these territories and the political violence and torture that created Indigenous people being refugees in this land. So it's like I'm coming with real humility and my continued work to be an ally and move into more being, you know, an accomplice and co-resistor in terms of taking on structures of power. And I hope that answers your question about what I'm doing here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vicky. Elder Roberta, I'd like to go back to you and again, thank you so much. We're really honored to have you here, not only creating the space today, but also joining our panel. And one of the things you and I talked, and you know, it's relates a little bit to Charlene's story, and also maybe to like the other end of Vicky, which is more common, unfortunately, which is a little bit the experiences that you have directly, like some of these stereotypes, and you told me a couple of stories, and you've shared a lot, so I won't ask you if you don't want to, and if you want to share something else, but I just wanted to, because there's a lot of people, you know, and we're talking about newcomers and Indigenous relationships, also that, you know, that we are aware that those things exist today and that, you know, that people actually experience those things. So, you know, if you want to share some of those stereotypes that you've heard when people have connected with you, and otherwise something else that you want to share as an introduction.
Well, I just want to share that, you know, one of this live with racism every day of our lives, you know, and all the names that the federal government comes out and calls us, like it used to be Indian, Native, Aboriginal, all of that. And as a child and a young woman, I really it really, really bothered me when people called me a dirty Indian or said Indian like it was a blasphemy, like a swear word. It really bothered me. And so then I was very excited when the new word of the day came out, First Nations. And so that I taught my children and my daughter that they are First Nations. And my daughter, who will be 27 this year, when she was about 3 years old, someone gave my sister and me a sockeye salmon. And unlike my Blackfoot sister, that was gold to us. And so my sister and I are all excited. And we have had a barbecue. I had a barbecue in my backyard. And my daughter loved it because everybody came around and it was such a happy time. And so we planned to have a barbecue, the sockeye, on the weekend. And so my daughter is excited with us, and she's kind of dancing around the living room. And then she looks at me, and she's been in daycare, preschool, virtually since she was born, because I had to work on often 2 jobs. And she's dancing around, then she looks at me and she says, "Mommy, what is a sockeye?" And I said, "Mariah, that's a fish." And then she was taught in preschool that fish are our friends and we don't eat our friends. And so then she looks at me in shock and she goes, "Oh, Mommy, we can't do that. Fish are our friends. We can't eat our friends. And ooh, I don't like fish." And my sister said, like, 'cause she's like, I balance between anybody who feels comfortable with their titles. And my sister said, "But all Indians love fish." And then she kind of had this look on her face of a little bit of relief. So I said, I knew she wanted to say something. I said, "So what, Mariah?" She looked at me and my sister and she said, "Oh, I'm glad I'm not an Indian," she said. So I, like that, in that journey of trying to, like, let us define who we are. And I just want to share that myself and my other colleague, matriarch and elders, are teaching out there that we really need to bring back the respect of the matriarchs and the women. Because it was the federal government that turned that around on us. For many, many thousands of years, the matriarchs were the guides. They were the ones that guided all the villages, and the men followed those directions. And I'll share another quick story about that. About 27 years ago, I was up in the Stalo territory in the Longhouse. They were teaching us about Stalo heritage, and they had the speaker of the house, and the man is he's sharing the journey and said, "In the Coast Salish territory, the men are the speakers." Of course, I don't know, maybe I haven't learned to hold my tongue yet. So up goes Roberta's hand, and I stand up, and I said, "Well, I guess I'm not a good Coast Salish woman because I'll always get up and speak." No, this was when we had so many elders at that time. Nobody said a word. So we finished the teachings in the morning. We go to feast with the elders. There were so many of those elders. And I'm sitting beside one of our Stalo women elders, matriarchs, and she gently put her hand on my arm and she said, "Roberta, I heard what you said back there in the Longhouse." And I kind of got a little bit scared. And she said, "Yes, the men were the speakers in Coast Salish territory because some of our longhouses were more than 1 mile long. We needed their big voices to speak and to share." And then she touched my arm again and she said, "Roberta, guess who told the men what to say?" So always elders teaching, sharing gently, matriarchs teaching, sharing that really gently. I'm able to do that today with others. But we really need to flip that back to the way it was in the past. And it was the federal government, its laws and its policies that forced men to be in charge of everything. And we need to flip it around back. And there will be healing, not just for the women, but when there's healing for the women, there will be healing for the men and the boys. So we need to change that back to the way it was, because it worked for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So Hajka Siam, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Riel, thank you so much for being here. We are honored to have you here. And following a little bit what Elder Roberta was saying around living with racism every day, you told me a little bit about like how this idea of that we're actually educated in racism, right? And we go, that's how we go about our lives. So again, I know it's a bit of a big question, but if you can frame a little bit that idea,
Sure.
that will be very good. Thank you.
I'll just start by introducing myself. Sego, my name is Riel Dupuy-Rossi. I'm Genyan Gehage and Algonquin on my father's side. That's Mohawk and Algonquin. And I'm Italian on my mother's side. And I'm from the Great Lakes region and the St. Lawrence River where the great white pines grow. That's our relatives of the Mohawk Nation and the birch for the Algonquin people. I grew up off reserve in Hamilton, Ontario, but on my territories, and I just want to acknowledge that. I've been working for about 10 years as an Indigenous counselor, serving our people, working with Indigenous people, and Charlene is one of my colleagues and Elder Roberta as well, so I just want to acknowledge the work that we do, and I've also had the good honor of collaborating with Vicki too, so I want to raise my hands to her. In terms of that question, I'm gonna just say what I have to say. I was, tossing and turning a little bit last night. I get a little bit nervous before I got to speak, right? Though I speak for a living and every day, and Elder Roberta's giggling because we've done many, many healing circles together, and I think she probably knows more than anybody in this room how I can talk. And as Mohawk people, we are known to be quite long-winded as well, so I'm holding up my traditions too. But I was tossing and turning because Javier, after a long work day, sends me an email saying, "Oh, Riel, we're going to open up the panel by asking you, that question about being educated into racism." And I was like, oh, dang, I'm just tired and hungry at this point, and I don't even remember what I had to say. So go for a long walk, take my evening, and I'm tossing and turning in the night, and I wake up to having had this dream of being on this panel, and all of a sudden somebody stands up and starts singing, "Oh, Canada." And I think, this is my moment. I can go to the bathroom, I don't need to hear "Oh, Canada" being sung today, but in the meanwhile, in the hustle and bustle of this dream, I didn't make it back on time for my talk, right? But through all of this dream, I did wake up at the sound of my alarm and had, the answer to this question insofar as I believe it to be true. And just thought I would share that background with you. I had the good fortune of meeting Javier, and we did have some preliminary conversations before this panel, and he asked me, we were talking about the dynamics of settlers existing on Turtle Island, and I said, with, some truth and some compassion, but also in the spirit of accountability, that at the end of the day, non-Indigenous people are educated into racism, that in a sense it's in the air that is breathed and the water that is drank and the cars that are driven and the condos that are bought and the loans that are given. Every single moment of every single day is infused with that principle of being educated into racism. And so I call on history to explain where I'm coming from when I say this, that you know, since I come from the east, I'm Mohawk, I'm Algonquin, but where in Mohawk territory is the first point of contact, 500, probably, you know, almost 600 years ago now is where the first non-native, you know, set of like explorers, colonists, whatever you want to call them, government representatives of the crown, made contact with our people in a place that is known as Hochelaga, on the shores of Hochelaga, which is, you know, now a neighborhood of Montreal, Quebec. And what ensued is from that contact 500 years ago, in the next 100 years in the east is, and across Turtle Island, which we refer to as North America, a genocide that took 90 to 95% of our relatives through military conquest, through brutal violence, through, you know, biological warfare. 90 to 95% of the Indigenous people who walked Turtle Island were killed. There was an attempted genocide, and that's the first point of colonial history. And then the reservation system, you know, the deterritorialization, to use a really big word, of our people, you know, pushing us onto reserves where not all of our peoples, even the people who survived, not all of our relatives could fit on reserve. Many, many, many of us, you know, including my family, we were pushed out of reserves, or reserves were never created for us, as is the case for the Algonquin. There's 2 reserves for hundreds of thousands of people. And there were millions and millions and millions of Indigenous people who lived on Turtle Island, who lived on these territories, and 90% of us were killed. And then, if that was not enough, our territories were taken from us. So when, you know, Charlene and Elder Roberta, as well as, you know, Vicky and her humility and accountability, acknowledge that we are refugees in our homeland, this is not even a metaphor. We were put on what they call prisons of grass. And I think that's a good way of looking at it, you know, starved. We weren't able to sustain our lives in the way that we had for tens and thousands of years. You know, we became prisoners of the Canadian government, wards of the state. And then if that wasn't enough, children started being taken away with the residential school. And, you know, I speak here not from a place of my mind, you know, I speak from the heart because my family went through this. I'm an intergenerational survivor of residential school, and I've had to do a lot of healing work to be able to stand in front of you today and even speak these words. You know, so the devastation of residential school, you know, and then foster care, and Elder Roberta did such a moving job of explaining the horrors of that experience. And I just want to take a moment to honor the resilience and the strength and the courage and, yes, the capacity, as Javier was saying, you know. It's incredible. So, you know, what is often not known is 40% more Indigenous children are in foster care today than were at the height of the operation of the residential school system. So as we look back on colonial history, it's important to acknowledge that the attempted genocide against Indigenous peoples is still ongoing. If the stealing of our children isn't enough, there's more than 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women on Turtle Island right now, you know, since 1970, 1960. So acknowledging that most reserves don't have clean water. And that's what I meant by, you know, the racism that we're educated into, being in this cup of water that we're drinking today, you know, that the community of White Rock can drink clean water from the taps, but right down the street, the reserve of Samiamu people are on boil alert for last 20 years or something, right, Cory? Yeah. So just to speak about the history of colonization and for me, when I woke up this morning, you know, I was thinking when we talk about being educated into racism, we often talk about what is excluded in curriculum. And yet what my dream brought to me in full clarity, and I thank my ancestors for that, is what we call structural or systemic racism, right? That the very foundation of this country called Canada is based on systematic attempt to annihilate the first peoples of these lands. First Peoples, our ancestors, you know, Mohawk are known to be quite tough, but in reality, all of our philosophy is about peace and love, joining in a good mind and having a good heart. And it was in that spirit that we had first relations with the settlers and the colonists who came. But that trust was broken and betrayed in so many ways. And it's that betrayal and then the violence that ensued that marks the foundation of this country called Canada, you know? So though it's important to have this kind of curriculum and this kind of history, you know, acknowledged in schools, it's also important to, I believe, acknowledge that when we're talking about being educated into racism as non-Indigenous people are, it is the very structure, the very foundation of this nation called Canada. So, Nyawagoa, great thanks in the Mohawk language for allowing me to speak and for listening with your good hearts and your good minds to what I had to say.
Thank you so much. Cory, how are you? Yeah, you're still here. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have you, not only as a panelist, but also as part of this partnership and this work that we're doing. And, you know, just to tell you that we've learned so much from the work you're doing and from, you know, your guidance, and part of what we're doing today also, you know, comes from you. So thank you so much. So I want to steer a little bit things, so this idea, like, it was to, how do we understand, I mean, for our lives, but also for today, our experiences, like especially for non-Indigenous people in relation to Indigenous presence in these lands. And also, I know that some people are probably asking themselves, well, where are we getting to the organizational, you know, dialogue? And I think with the work that you're doing in Bcit, bringing this Indigenous vision to the whole new strategic plan, and you've been, you know, I want to focus a little bit on the process that you invited me to, and you know, when you did the Indigenous circles, and you invited a lot of non-Indigenous people also. So, you know, with those ideas of like, who are we in these unceded lands as non-Indigenous people? Are we, you know, settlers? You know, but also trying to bring that Indigenous side of things to the place where it really belongs. So if you know, as an introduction, and obviously, again, you can introduce yourself if you want, but can you share a little bit of like, how did you see that engagement of non-Indigenous people in these processes that you put together to include the Indigenous vision in the strategic plan of Bcit? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. So at Bcit, we've undergone a process, as every post-secondary does, at a certain period of time, creating a new strategic plan. So our board approved the new Bcit strategic plan in March 19th. Along with that process, I was asked by the President, Kathy Kinloch of Bcit, to create an Indigenous vision or an Indigenous strategic plan that would make up and be part of the Bcit strategic plan. There are three main goals in our plan. There are three goals under each of those goals. Number 7, and it's not in any order, it's just the way it falls on the page, is a commitment to Indigenous people at Bcit, which we've created our Indigenous strategic plan, and from that we will, and was approved by our board, and we will create a operational plan which will take Bcit in a place that it hasn't gone before. We've been doing a lot of great things at Bcit, and I guess the process of it was, there's no point me just sitting down and writing what I think and feel. We've got to do a consultation, and consultation, there was some people had some issues with me consulting with non-Indigenous people. Well, Indigenous people have to lead the way. We know what we need, we know what we want, and that's a valid point. We absolutely do, but there's no sense doing that without the consultation with non-Indigenous people. So we did lead in Zah's here. Zah Joseph is here, who helped me through this process, organized all the meetings, and we did 14 consultation meetings. We did online surveys. a whole pile of one-on-one consultations, and I think we've come up with an Indigenous vision for BCIT that will be a very positive experience, lead to very positive change at BCIT. Some of the highlights are that no longer will it just be my job to advance indigenization and reconciliation at BCIT, but as senior leaders we're evaluated every year based on the goals in the strategic plan, so which means that every BCIT senior leader will also be evaluated on what they're doing to advance reconciliation and indigenization at BCIT, which is sadly, even in 2019, unusual at many post-secondary institutions. I see my friend Verna here. Of course, it's not unusual at NVIT, which is an Indigenous-focused institution, not owned, but operated, Indigenous-operated institution, though I imagine, Verna, you have a lot of ownership over what's happened at NVIT. I think the important, just to highlight on some of the points that people have brought up and how do we make this change, whether it's at BCIT or whether it's at the organizations and institutions that you all work with or are involved in or are in support of, is that the absolute most important thing, it's kind of a four-stage process, I see it, and I appreciate, Vicki, what you said about Franz's work. It is not spoken about, and yet, again, in 1940s, he clearly understood the relationship between colonized and colonizers and colonized people, or essentially oppressors and oppressed people, and his words are true today. I think the saddest part of it is that oppressed people often become also oppressors. So it's important to note and comment that as Indigenous people, we also have a hurdle to overcome, and that's to get rid of the lateral violence that's in our community and our failure to work together, because we have been successful in this country. When we have worked together, we essentially, because of the ethnic vote, as Jacques Parizeau said, prevented Quebec from separating from Canada. And I'm sure our Indigenous brothers and sisters in Quebec are very happy and glad. I mean, not, you know, there's issues with Canada, of course, it's not perfect, but you certainly would have been ignored had Quebec been allowed to succeed. And that was because Indigenous people in Quebec voted at a rate that they have never voted before. The same as the defeat of the Meech Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accord happened because of Indigenous people. And I don't think that's the last we'll see of Indigenous people uniting and coming together. The absolute vital first step for everybody, how do I do, what can I do, is knowledge. You've heard some facts today. There are, in fact, more Indigenous children in care today than ever attended residential schools in Canada. And that's a huge, huge trauma that Indigenous people are still experiencing. Residential schools no longer exist. The intergenerational trauma still exists, but also the process and the taking children into care is equivalent to that trauma of residential school, and it's still happening. Indigenous people make up 5% of the population. We're at the negative end of every single socioeconomic indicator in this country. It's very important to remember that. When people say, well, why are Indigenous people treated differently? Well, I came to this country, I worked hard, why can't they work hard? Well, there is a multitude of barriers and effects of laws and policies that still exist that keep us, like I said, I have a status card. If I die without a will, I'm treated differently. In the province of British Columbia, my health care is different than every single one of you in the room, unless you're from a BC First Nation. If I needed to go on income assistance, I'm treated completely differently than every single one of you in this room, again, unless you're a status Indian. The legacy of the reserve system still exists today in Canada, and the effects and consequences of that still exist. The government of Canada still defines who is and who is not an Indian in this country, and I use that word because that's what it says on the card. It says I'm certified as a status Indian under section blah, blah, and blah, blah, blah. And so the legacy of all of that in the federal Indian policy was very intentional to assimilate and divide and conquer Indigenous people. So the first step, the first thing that you can do is acquire that knowledge. I know it's challenging, you know, English as a second language and learning the history of Indigenous people can be challenging, but that's why we created the guide for newcomers. That's why we created the Indigenous awareness modules at BCIT that all of you have access to. That's why everything we create and write will have a Creative Commons license on it, so anyone can use that information education. We are intending to translate the modules into different languages as well. That's a project that will, now that we've done the Indigenous vision and the various things we have going on at Bcit, in the next year I hope to be able to, at least Baldwin and I know we've talked about getting it translated to Chinese, certainly Punjabi, Arab. I was talking to the people in Ottawa. There's some Arab speakers there that are happy to try to support that initiative. So knowledge, and I often hear from newcomers, how do we find this knowledge? I don't know where this knowledge is. I'm sure every single one of us knows how to Google, and every single one of us has this. It's just a simple matter of Googling it. Yes, there's a challenge in deciphering the knowledge is what is correct and authentic. So then it's trying to find out and authenticate that and look at the sources of your knowledge. The modules and the guide are not the be-all, end-all. There's certainly limitations on them. They're meant to just be a starting point. So then you can start there and move on from that. So having that knowledge is absolutely important to learn the truth about Indigenous people in Canada. Then I'd say the second stage is to recognize your privilege. Again, a lot of people say to me, well, I'm also poor. I'm also this, I'm also that. But each and every one of us, the fact that we're in this room, have privilege in some way, have a level of privilege that can help make change in this country, and recognizing the privilege that you have simply by being in Canada, that all of us have. Yes, Indigenous people have a hard, history with Canadians, and my students often ask me, what's the, well, how do you feel? Don't you think it'd be better to be Indigenous in another country? I have to say that there's no other country in this world that I'd rather be discriminated in than Canada. And I say that not to make light of the discrimination, but to make light of the fact that I'm fairly certain I'm not going to die for saying what I say. That's not the same in other countries. So recognizing the privilege that you have, recognizing the unconscious bias that we all have no matter what. And I often, when I try to get this concept across to my students, I use the example of how did you decide where to sit in the classroom? And I always get all kinds of answers. Sometimes, well, I like sitting in the back. I want to be as far away from you as possible. Some want to be right in the front so they can because they get distracted otherwise. And I've had people say, well, I sat here because he's pretty handsome, or she's she's cute, or whatever. So they come up with all kinds of things. Well, if I get bored, I want to be able to go to the bathroom, so they sit close to the door, or I want to be able to leave without So we all have these biases and reasons and things that make us make decisions. Of course, those are not really damaging biases, except, of course, if all of a sudden there's a student that nobody's sitting beside, right? Or people, so we can see how these things happen. So recognizing our unconscious bias and recognizing the thought processes that you have in making decisions and choosing to do what you do is really important. And then the final point that I would like to get across is that you have to do something about it. We can't stand by. I'm sure you've all heard, obviously during the Holocaust, and then they came for me. No, I didn't stand up for the Jewish people. I didn't stand up for the homosexuals, which of course was the word at the time. I didn't stand up for the disabled because I wasn't part of them. But the reality is this is a country where we have to ensure that everybody has a voice, everybody has a place, everybody can be safe and secure, and that responsibility extends to all of us. And again, I hear from newcomers sometimes, well, I'm just new to Canada, I'm not really responsible, as was Katie mentioned a little earlier, I'm not responsible for this, but you're here in Canada, and we all are responsible to ensure that Canada is a good country, is a safe country, is an inclusive country. And it's often, so by action, whatever your roles and positions are, and Javier and I have had this conversation before, is what can you do in your job, in your position? What can you do for yourself to educate yourself and create action? What can you do as part of a family? What can you do as part of a workplace, employment place? What can your organization do as part of a larger group of immigrants serving organizations or institutions or wherever you are? And what can you do to contribute to Canada? And I think every action is valuable, and it doesn't mean you have to go and radically transform, but even as Amsa we've talked about educating every one of your employees, having them read the indigenization, the guide. Plus, through BC Campus, there's indigenization guides that are out there now. There are the modules. There's so much information and learning that has to happen. And I think everybody has the opportunity to make some kind of difference. And I think you can't underestimate the difference that one person can make in just in your own little world, right? You don't stand up for racism, stand up against it, and ensure that it doesn't happen, right? And again, if it doesn't include you, don't take the lead on it, but be an ally, be a supporter, and advocate for that. So I hope that you all feel, I mean, part of the goal today was to have everybody feel empowered and understand that there is a movement that needs to happen towards bridging the gap between newcomers and First Nations people and Indigenous people in this country. And I know we're going to talk more about the ways to actually do that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Cory. Thank you, everyone. So we're gonna do like the second round of the discussion. I invite you to have a dialogue. I'll have some questions for you. Again, also, facilitate a little bit. But also, if you have questions for each other, or some comments, just please, feel free, let me know, and then, look at each other. But just for people in the audience to know, so with this introduction, we're gonna go to some of the issues that we have been seeing in the sector. Amsa, as an umbrella organization, has access to a lot of information from members across BC, but also across Canada through other umbrellas. So it was not easy to choose, what topics we can discuss today. But I think there are, I'm just going to put them in three. I know that I gave you four, but we're going to do one and we'll double it. But one of the main things that we've seen, or that, organizations have told us, is this idea of engaging in this type of work through the commonalities and shared struggles between immigrants and First Nations and Indigenous people. And, Charlene, for sure, pointed that out. So we'll discuss a little bit about that. Then the other issue that comes up a lot is this idea and this concept that we use a lot in the sector of multiculturalism and diversity. And now we're starting to talk about indigeneity, which are three words that, sustainability. And you start, talking about those words, and, we need to actually try to understand and center them in what they really mean. And the last part that probably we're going to do, we'll double it because, Cory, you've introduced a little bit that idea also, in the organizational leadership. And I want to make a point here because when we were defining this symposium and this work, and we were talking about leaders, we really don't talk, or not exclusively, about positional leadership. We're talking about people that want to do things in their organizations and that they want to lead processes and that they want to be active. So that's what, when we talk about organizational leadership, is coming from that point of view, right? Can be an ED, but can be from worker, can be, anybody that wants to lead a process. And within that organizational leadership also is that idea of being an ally that you've just made a quick note, and we'll talk about that. So starting then with the commonalities. So we see how so immigrant service providers and in the immigration sector, maybe in others too, I will speak about the immigration sector, acknowledging that there are some people outside of it, but because this is what we know and what we can speak about. So immigrant service providers work with newcomers with experiences that include trauma, racism, oppression, violence, and have barriers to settlement and employment, putting them in vulnerable positions and subject to stereotypes. It is in relation to those aspects where organizations find commonalities with experiences of Indigenous people, designing them and providing solutions accordingly, or that's what we see that this is going or moving towards. However, and I think it's a big however, those tools that we've used traditionally in our sector have not traditionally included concepts like self-governance, land return, colonialism, and settlement. And they haven't included either self-reflective processes to understand our own position as non-Indigenous organizations in unceded territories, but we all put our acknowledgements in our websites and so. So one of the things that I would like to ask the panel, and please feel free, any of you to start. So how can we understand those commonalities? We say oppression, violence, racism. Do they affect Indigenous people differently than newcomers? Do we need to understand that there are differences? Are there differences? And then how do we start by understanding those commonalities in this context that we're talking about?
Is this going to be like one of those, I got the answers, so you press it real quick? Yeah, right. And could we make teams? Because I want Cory on my team. You know, the other day I was walking with Charlene and we were just on our lunch break, you know, enjoying the cherry blossoms and just sort of discussing a training that we do at our work for called Indigenous Cultural Safety. It's for non-Indigenous healthcare workers to learn how to be sensitive to the history that Indigenous patients carry in their healthcare roles. And Charlene was just telling me about a training that she had done and that this issue actually came up directly from one of the participants. So if I may defer to you on this, I just thought that you did a really good job.
Yeah, so I'm one of the facilitators of the Indigenous Cultural Safety Training. And the timeline created by Riel, who is so very humble, is very, it's an experience, and it is provocative. It's emotionally provocative because it's going through 500 years of colonization in Canada. And at the end, you know, people have the opportunity to comment. And we were doing our closing circle, and a woman became very emotional, and she was crying, and she said, "I do not like the term settler. I do not like it. My grandparents and my parents had to flee the Holocaust. So we have a history of genocide. We came here, and we are also now connected to this land. We are connected to this land, and I don't like the term settler because I was not involved in colonization. I too am a survivor of genocidal forces." And so I said to her, "You're not alone. This comes up a lot. Many people are not, they're not comfortable with the term settler. It's unsettling." And so I said to her that my friend Kalumpa Bob, who is an amazing, brilliant actor, a Haida woman. Her mother is a famous writer, Lee Miracle, a Stalo woman who is just amazing, a pioneer. And she said, we had a friend who we were having the same discussion. "I am not a settler. I am connected to this land, and I don't like the term settler." And Kalumpa Bob said, "If you have a home in Canada, and you are not originally from Canada, you have settled in Canada. And you have settled and received that benefit of settling at the expense of Indigenous people who have suffered from colonization. You are benefiting from colonization. So therefore, you are a settler, and you are a newcomer and a visitor. And if you acknowledge that, that creates better relations." So I said this to the woman who was very emotional, and then I said, "I encourage you to research this more. Seek out groups perhaps that maybe there are articles, maybe there are other forums where you can discuss this. And she said, no, no, thank you. What you told me helps me. I feel better about this now. I understand.
Anyway, I mean, also, we're talking about the Immigration and Settlement Service, right? So, you know. So one of the things, and I might just like go back and forth because I think that makes sense. Like this idea of, you know, when we do a settlement and when we open, you know, our doors to newcomers, is this idea of multiculturalism and diversity, and is this idea that, you know, the way in which we use this word might ignore the history behind what this word means in the struggles and the fights of Indigenous people, of actually preserving their identity by not becoming part of the multicultural context and being one more multicultural layer of Canada. So I think that's an important one because we do use that word, like, you know, that's this idea of diversity and inclusion and multiculturalism. So, like, if we want to maybe reframe that or take a look to how do we understand that, how can we go about that?
I think one thing I'd like to say about that is this is often a common thing that comes up between different groups of people. While I wasn't part of it, I'm uncomfortable with the terminology, I'm uncomfortable with this, I'm uncomfortable with that, is that it has to be recognized and acknowledged that every single Indigenous person in this country has nowhere else to go. You know, every single immigrant or newcomer or settler to this land has somewhere else to go. Not that they may want to go, or not that it's safe, or not that it is on their list of places to go, but there is a place where their language is alive, there is a place where their culture is alive, there is a place that the history that they have come from is alive. And I am certainly not saying that it's healthy and functioning in every country in the world where they may have whether a refugee or escape prosecution and all of that, but every other language and culture in this country has somewhere else where it is thriving. For Indigenous people, we have nowhere else to go. There are only Kwakwaka'wakw people on the north of Vancouver Island and the adjoining mainland. That is the only place in the world that our culture is alive. And yes, I can go and live and move anywhere else, but I am not going to find a Kwakwaka'wakw community in I don't know, what town? Venice. I'm not going to find one in Cape Town, South Africa. I'm not going to find a community of expats, Kwakwaka'wakw people anywhere else in the world. The other difference is fundamentally, goes to the core of Canada as a country, is that Indigenous people are the only ethnic group, only group of people that are set out and apart in the Constitution of Canada. In Section 9124, Indigenous people, the federal government is responsible for Indigenous people, it says Indians, responsible for Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. There is no other group in this country, newcomers are not, settlers are not, that are put into the Constitution. So the relationship at its core is fundamentally different between Indigenous people and newcomers. If you came and immigrated to Canada prior to 1951, yeah, people have said, oh, 7 generations my family's been farming this land. Great. My family would only have been allowed to farm this land since 1951. If you came to this country prior to 1982, you were allowed to marry whoever you wanted without discrimination as to your status in place in Canada. That's not true for my family. Pre-1951, our status was determined by who we married by the Government of Canada prior to 1982. You come and you're newcomers, you're embraced into Canada with health care, with benefits that never have extended to Indigenous people. So it's important to have Indigenous people apart from diversity, apart from multiculturalism, because we are fundamentally in a different place than all the other groups in Canada. That doesn't mean our suffering is any more. That doesn't mean our suffering, I couldn't imagine being forced I guess one thing, I went to a school, part of United World Colleges. I don't know if anybody's heard about United World Colleges, but if you haven't, please Google it. It is a powerful movement across this world that has and will have in September 19 different schools around the world. And it's a boarding school. And the one in Canada is founded off to Lester B. Pearson's Nobel Prize winning speech, how can there be peace without understanding? How can there be an understanding if people don't know each other? And I think that's kind of what's guided me through a lot of my life, is that people must get to know each other, must get to know the truth about each other, and recognize that there are differences and nobody owns suffering. There is horrendous suffering going on around the world, and I can't imagine having to leave my country. I've never even left BC. I've never lived anywhere, well, I have, but I've never lived less than 5 minutes from the Pacific Ocean. I can't imagine having to go and live in Mali, for example, or go and live, to a place that's completely foreign. So the issues and challenges that immigrants face and newcomers face in this country are huge, but they are different. The suffering, you can't quantify or qualify suffering for each group, but Indigenous people are in a very different place than newcomers to this land.
Thanks so much for that. I just want to speak on behalf of white people in the face of white supremacy, which is what makes everything you're saying required to be spoken aloud. Like you were saying, how the water is invisible to the fish kind of thing. I just want to think about this sector because, when I was the clinical supervisor at VAST, and I've worked with survivors of torture in many places in the world, and I still supervise this work, and I'm honored to be part of this sector, when I gave one of my first workshops on, quote, trauma 25 years ago and was connected with VAST, an Aboriginal man, and I set out, here's a definition of torture and here's a definition of political violence. State-sanctioned violence that's implements of power by the government for its own purposes, where the actors of these atrocities are going to have perfect impunity, and the purpose is to control people, control dissent, kill resistance, and get what you want in terms of resource extraction and land. And an Aboriginal man stood up and said, Dr. Reynolds, and I wasn't a doctor yet, he said, this Aboriginal man said, would you say that residential schools and survivors of residential schools, would you say that that is political violence and torture? And this was like over 20 years ago. And I said, yes, absolutely. If we look at these descriptions, it's undeniable. This is before cell phones. When I got home, my answering machine was full. From the lawyers on my board, I was called into an emergency meeting and I was told to recant that we are supporting refugees and survivors of torture. We are not supporting First Nations people. That's not what we're doing. As if, and I was asked to defend that and take that back, and I said, this may be my departure from our work because I won't back down. And they said, what do you want to have happen? I said, you know what, you're all going to be ashamed of yourself, and it's going to be soon. Our sector has taken up a political view of our solidarity with Indigenous people. I think it's a collective shame. I really honor your move and this collective move to be accountable. This is late in coming. So, I think it's easy to look at the Canadian state. I think we need to look at our own sector and our own work. As a psychologist, I hold collective accountabilities for that. As a white settler, I have different accountabilities to the territories than someone who came as a refugee, a person of color settler, or a black settler, or a racialized settler. I acknowledge that. It's not a binary of Indigenous people and settlers. There's a multiplicity of settlers. That's where multiculturalism and diversity can come in, our different accesses to power. And then what does that mean for me as a white settler in terms of my accountabilities to the land and trying to follow protocol? And that would be a different thing than someone who's required to have to come to Canada to get refuge, but you got to ask the people of the land if you can come here. And one of the most important things that happened for me 2 decades ago again was led by the Chilean community. And if anybody in this room is connected to the Chilean community, hands up, because that community sharpened the political awareness and acumen in this city. But the Chileans came to me, and I was seeing them as a therapist of survivors of torture when Pinochet and the American government overthrew democratically elected socialist President Allende in Chile, 1973. All of those Chileans, so many of them were tortured and murdered. Many came to Canada. These folks were political survivors of political violence because of their politics. And one of the key political issues they were involved in was indigenous territory in Chile. They were on to this. And so when they were here, when their children were born and they realized they weren't going to return to Chile, they were like, how do we stay in these territories? We are replicating the very politics that had us unsettling our own government, which led to us being tortured. And so I was part of connecting Chilean multiple communities with multiple indigenous communities, and we had a ceremony together to ask permission to be on the land as refugees. You know, and that was moving for me. And you know, we tried to make that be a known thing, and it wasn't picked up in other refugee communities, and it wasn't picked up in organizing. I know that I'm busy doing settlement and doing, quote, trauma work, which I think is just responding to oppression with survivors of torture, but we have to look at ourselves for this. And, you know, our collective, like what I think the way through here is not personal guilt, but collective accountability and having the moral courage for that. Thank you for letting me speak to this. Thanks.
Thank you to each and every one of you that have shared, and I really, when I said we need to bring the respect back for our matriarchs in leadership, and it is about respect, you know, bringing that respect back and sharing that with people who are new to the country, and that we show respect and role model respect. And I just want to share, like, you know, that thinking of in the strength of our matriarchs from the past. You know, I shared that my mom, 8 of my mom's children were taken from her and put in Cooper Island Residential School. I work with this man, Shawetmik traditional chief, a Microtasket, and he always used to say, we are so connected to the land. It's like the blood that runs through our veins. And I kept thinking, why do you always say this, Mike? And I just want to share that my sister moved to Richmond like more than 40 years ago, and I followed her shortly. And we always loved Steveston, always just so connected to Steveston. And never knew why, we just loved it so much. And then when we found our mom in 1994, we wanted to bring her, we wanted to connect, to bond, to get to know our mom. And I said, Mom, we want to bring you to this place, we just love it so much. We'll go to our shops and then we'll bring you for fish and chips. I think all my mom heard was fish and chips. She ate fish all her life. And so we pick up our mom, we go to Steveston, we go to our shops, and then we're walking up the main street of Steveston, which is Moncton, if anyone knows Steveston. And we don't know our mother, we just met her. She's quite up there in her age. Our mom starts chuckling away to herself, walking down the street. And my sister and I get all like nervous, we're looking at each other. Nobody said anything, why is Mom laughing? So we get in the cafe, we make our order, we get our tea, and I said, Mom, can I ask, why were you laughing back there on the street? And she said, well, I was laughing because the last time I was here, it was mud and boards. And you know, to keep my mother out of Cooper Island Residential School, my great auntie and uncle had a fish boat, and they came to work. In the height of the fishing industry, they had 16 canneries in operation in Steveston. And they would come and they used our people because we had thousands of years of expertise working with fish. So they used our people a lot. And my great auntie and uncle would come on their fish boat, and to keep my mom out of the residential school, from the time she was 3 years old till she was 11, they brought my mom on the fish boat. She'd sit on the fish boat. She taught me, in Cowichan territory, you start to knit when you're 2 years old. So she would knit, she said, you start off with slippers when you're 3. And so she would sit on the boat and knit while great auntie and uncle are working in the cannery. And if anybody knows about the canneries, you had to work really fast or you get fired just like that, right on the spot. No union support, no second chances, you get fired. Well, what she said, when my great auntie got behind a little bit, because my mom was little, she'd say, come in, push the cans ahead for me. Push the cans ahead. So my mom would go in, and part of why she was laughing was the memory. So she said, so I don't get fired. And so she pushed the cans ahead. My great auntie got caught up. And at the end of the day, my great auntie and uncle would bring her up to the only store in Steveston, which was a Japanese store, and buy her an ice cream cone. So when you're 3 years old, that's a pretty big treat and a really fond memory. So that's part of why she was laughing. But you know, when my mom was 11, the Indian agent caught my mother, put her into Cooper Island Residential School. My mother did not speak English. She said to me that the nuns were beating her with what was equivalent to like a 2x4. They didn't break just one of my mom's legs, but both of my mom's legs. As I share out there, unfortunately for Cooper Island, my mom did not pass away like many, many of our relatives. They just put them out back there. They had to do something with my mother. They took her off the island. They put her in the hospital. And my mother shared. It took me 4 years to bond, to listen to all the intimate stories of my mother's experiences. I was the only child that she shared with. She said my great-grandma, her grandma, went into that hospital. And my mom said not even the police could get my mother away from my great-grandmother. Although she did not return to Cooper Island Residential School, she also did not forget what happened. And I just want to share with that thinking, like I said, nowhere in the world was it mandated by the federal government. I want to jump forward in history. One of my brothers, from the torture of the residential school, hung himself in 1986. My second brother, who also ran away, who was super tortured, lived on the streets, got off the streets, joined the armed forces. He said that saved his life. Eventually, he passed away from the wasting of HIV the day he turned 31, 6 weeks before my daughter was born. At that point in time, I was in counseling for 10 years. My counselor kept saying, Roberta, you should go to the police on what happened in that home. I was too scared. We were wondering why some of our siblings ran away. And I liken it to, you know, when people capture wild animals, they chain them, they torture them, they beat them. After a period of time, they take the chain off and they don't run away. I liken myself and some of my siblings to that. We didn't run because we were too afraid. When my second brother died, I decided maybe I will make that call. It still took me 6 months to make that call. I happened to get a good police person. He said, you know, Roberta, why don't you come down and talk about it with me? Even when I got to the police station, I put a quarter in the meter because I thought I would be right back out again. I came out 4.5 hours later, having given my statement. At that time, 7 of my sisters were still alive. He encouraged me to get my 7 sisters to give statements. From that point on, led into a 5-year journey into the Supreme Court of Canada. They had to the Crown really wanted to get somebody. Although the foster mother was just as culpable as the foster father in that torture, beatings, everything. They gave her a pass so she could testify against him so they could get someone. In the Supreme Court of Canada, the foster mother said, "We didn't think we were doing anything wrong to those children. We were told to do this to those children." That was to beat our culture, our language out of us. That is why I say what was different that happened in the foster homes, that happened in the residential schools, the very same things. The thinking, that's what I'm trying to connect with what you were saying, Vicky, is that thinking, the thinking is pushed on to others. And that's why people come and told by the media, told by the larger society, and therefore become that same way of thinking, of sitting in judgment about who we are, not about who we were. But again, I say, you know, it was our matriarchs, our grandmas, our great-grandmothers that were very, very strong and powerful. When my mom shared that story about my great-grandmother, when my elders helped me on my healing journey, and that was dealing with my identity, which I helped many, many others. Because I share out there many times, when you are grounded in you, who you are, your identity and your family's place in history, you are very, very strong. That's what my elders helped me do. That's what meeting my mom helped me do. My spirit started to stand up, and it is strong today. So when my mom tells me the story about my great-grandma, I share out there many, many times. My mom was very, very shy and quiet. She knew a lot. It was all up here. I could say, "Mom, do you know so-and-so?" She'd know their first husband, their second husband, all of their children, all of their grandchildren. And it was like our training, our common experience of our oral histories. But she was quiet, she was shy. She didn't talk, but she knew a lot, and she did a lot of healing work. So I say out there many times, any bit of shyness you see in Elder Roberta comes from my mother. Any of the power you see in Elder Roberta comes from my great-grandmother. So I just wanted to share out there. And you know what? I share the journey of sitting in the Supreme Court of Canada. Anybody who would do that can face anything and anyone and any question. Because let me tell you, when you're attacked by the defense lawyer. So I welcome any questions out there anytime I speak, because nothing could be as bad as that. And I welcome, like when we talk about truth, it's our truth, but it's also everyone else's truth. If you feel that way, if you think that way, I'm okay if you say it. Because if you get it out, if it's negative, well, I'm not a settler, I'm not this, or I didn't do this as the nun said to us. That's okay with me, because I myself too would rather hear the truth. And then we can go from there. And if it's right at the bottom, we can only go up, and we can only go up together. Haijka Siem, thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think that with with sharing that and that idea of the truth, and we can move from there. And how, we're recognizing the suffering and the experiences, and we're talking about how in the sector we try to find those commonalities to work on them. What we see and what we've heard from our members is that one of the aspects is, because we come from a sector that is designed to serve, and we can talk about the complexity of, bringing people to Canada and consent, and who has the consent and who is giving us those consent also later. But maybe just to follow up a little bit on Elder Roberta's last story. So we're a sector that is designed to serve. So our first idea of what we see is, well, now that we want to establish relationships with Indigenous people, then we're going to serve them, right? We're going to adapt our programs, and we're going to, do something for them. So I would like to also ask you, how can we take a look, because we're talking about all these differences, right? Like the different context. Cory, you were saying how, there's no, none of your people in Venice, or, and that we're talking about how First Nations and Indigenous people, they have some claims with the government that makes them totally apart from being a multicultural part of this country. So in that idea of serving, and thinking about the role as we try to engage in establishing relationships, and is really our role to serve Indigenous people, or do we have to think about it differently? And how can we go about that role, and how can we go out thinking of our role, and what type of tools that we don't have we can start thinking about? Because it seems that it's a bit of a different thing that we're getting into, different to what we've been doing.
Yeah, thank you for $500. Thank you, Javier. It's an important question. I mean, as I sit and listen to the question, I do feel a deep churning within me as somebody who, whose heart beats with the blood of my ancestors, my relatives who have been on Turtle Island since time immemorial, to be sort of asked a question and, about us being served, by people who haven't been here very long. And your patience while I formulate this is very appreciated. I come from the Mohawk Nation. I come from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who joined 7 great nations together, and we exist on a territory that is so vast and inhabits the Great Lakes of what is now known as Canada to some, a huge territory that spans all the way down to New York, all the way up north of these lakes. And our philosophies, our governance system is said, to have informed how American democracy functions today at the best of times. But nonetheless, this notion of representation and democracy. We have language systems that speak to the nature of existence and are attuned to the harmony and the respect that we as human beings are told to show to Mother Earth, to Father Sky, to Brother Sun and Grandmother Moon, that we're taught to be reverent. We're also taught to give thanks, great thanks for everything that's provided to us as, Mohawk people on our territories. Everything has been provided to us, so we thank Great Spirit, we thank all of our relations on a daily basis for everything that's been provided for us. And as in return, there's a sense of responsibility to be keepers of the land to appreciate and honor what's been gifted to us as human beings. And for tens of thousands of years, since time immemorial, we kept our territories clean. The water was pure. And, you know, I've been told that the great Tree of Peace, where the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was created, was 250 feet tall white pine. 250 feet were the trees, the height of the trees in the territories that I come from. And, you know, that the beaver were as big as small bears, you know. And this is the knowledge that lives in my bones, you know, about my territory. And I want to honor the knowledge that lives in the Indigenous people in the room today about their territories. And, you know, it came to me through healing intergenerational and complicated and traumatic grief, as they so-called, you know, but about, you know, as Vicky is good at clarifying, like, this is about violence. It's not about trauma. It's about violence, you know, and it is. But that knowledge that I carry in my heart and in my blood and in my bones about my connection to the land and how my people live on that territory, in a sense, and the Coast Salish nations are really good at saying, we're the hosts here. You know, it's our sacred responsibility and our sacred role to be the hosts and the steward of this land. And I want to give special honoring to the matriarchs here. You know, my nations are matrilineal. It was the clan mothers who taught all of the chiefs what to do and what to say and how to conduct themselves with other nations and other peoples, you know. So these are time-honored, very wise traditions based on a desire for peace. Skenen goage is how we say, you know, our greetings, and it means I wish you the great peace. And for a very, very, very long time, we lived with that great peace before the last 500 years. But those tens of thousands of years are much greater and much stronger than the last 500 years, as trying as they have been. And we get a sense of that in hearing from Elder Roberta's generous sharing of what her and her family have gone through. We get a sense of just how intimate the violence against our people has been, you know. So when we're being asked, you know, what is the role of the immigration sector, you know, in adapting programs and policies to include Indigenous people, I personally will speak from where I stand to say that I believe people who have Canadian citizenship, who have come here under the umbrella of Canada, you know, whether it was 500 years ago or, you know, 20 years ago, have a responsibility to hold the Canadian government accountable for what it has done and continues to do against the First Peoples of this land. And we, you know, to speak to Vicky's point about Frantz Fanon, like, and our elders say this to us all of the time, like, these are not our illnesses. We did not have child abuse in our societies before residential school. Like, we had, you know, very good relationships with each other that Elder Roberta is talking about was based on respect. You know, so if anything, I think that you know, there's a Indigenous healing movement other elders have talked about, that there's a collective movement to heal among Indigenous peoples from the trauma and the violence of colonization. We're working to reclaim our inheritances. We're working to reclaim our sacred responsibility to the land, to each other, to Mother Earth, you know. But in a sense, to make no mistake that the diseases and the oppression and the violences and the scars and the wounds that we have incurred are not from us. These are not our diseases. They're not our illnesses. We, in a sense, do not need anyone's help. Justice needs to be served on this territory, and I believe that that begins with non-Indigenous people who are living here holding the Canadian government accountable for this 500 years of colonization. So thank you again for listening with your good hearts and your good minds.
OCM, thank you. Thank you so much, Rial. And I just want to share out there, like, I don't believe it's the agencies that create these policies and exclusiveness. I feel that comes down from the top. We need to hold the accountability at the top because they create these conditions. Oh, you can have this if you do this and this and this. You can have this, but you can only do it for this and that. And that comes from the top. And I share out there many, many times too that policy brought us down and killed us. What I want the federal government to do is let policy bring us back up and give us back our lives. OCM, and we need to be our ways, inclusiveness. Inclusive rather than exclusive. And that everybody could have that mandate of inclusiveness, no matter what it is. And that way we wouldn't have people on the outside, people very marginalized who just need that little tiny bit of help to help them up. So that's everybody, not just this and this and this. OCM, OCM.
Thank you so much. So what I hear is, that when we think about establishing relationships and doing this type of work, we might need to steer our, look to start somewhere else that, than some, I'm not going to say everybody, but, some of the organizations are starting, like, just looking at how we build those ideas of truth, those ideas of, like, we don't have our own, the traditional role might not be the one that we need to establish for this type of work. And in that, I think it ties, and we're going to finish with this because we have to go for brunch, but working brunch, by the way. But in that idea of, what is then our role as non-Indigenous organizations and, as being an ally, if you want to comment a little bit on that, or if that's something that is is an appropriate concept, or what does it mean, and how we can go. Yeah.
Maybe I'll say something about that. Thanks so much for bringing this up. I think, I teach a lot of different courses in the master's and PhD programs. In every course I teach, I put Gord Hill's book on. It's a graphic novel called 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance. And I always get questions from the school, what's this got to do with family therapy? What's this got to do with diversity course? What's this got to do with the trauma course? What's this? It's got to do with every course that happens on Indigenous territory. That's my answer to you, Javier. As the sector that's working with newcomers, asylum seekers, refugees, and survivors of torture, we need to do this work not to help First Nations people, because this is our work to do to be able to stand on these territories. So what is colonization, decolonization, unsettling, and accountabilities to territories got to do with newcomers? Absolutely everything. It's a place we should start with people to start in a good way because they're standing on these lands. And you can't be well if what you're replicating is oppression and genocide. We can't do mental wellness with people when what we're doing is political violence. So I think, again, this is about kind of situating ourselves, again, to embrace the discomfort and spiritual pain that's required in keeping ourselves implicating, and to not patronize survivors of torture and newcomers that they can't handle it. They can handle that there's an accountability for political displacement and torture. Right, to welcome people in a good way. I think this is one of the ways psychology patronizes people, and I think what we want to do is track ethics, because everybody wants to do ethical work, and when you track ethics, you track vulnerability, and whoever's most vulnerable, that's who you have to be accountable to first, and that's the people of these territories. So, thanks.
So I just want to give, these last 2-3 minutes, if you want to just give, there's so much that's still, to be talked, but hopefully we'll get something more out of the gathering in the tables. But within those ideas, if there's some final remarks that you want to do.
I guess I'd just say, add to everything that's been said, is that it's absolutely important. The job of settlement agencies and organizations is to help the person settle. into a new land, into a new country, and the most effective settlement is when they have the true history and the truth of the reality of which they're going into. And it doesn't matter what your job is or what area you're in. Successful organizations and people going forward in Canada, because we have at least come to the place in the acknowledgement of reconciliation, will be those people and organizations that understand their relationship with Indigenous people. It doesn't matter if you own a bakery, some people want to make mines, build a mine. You have to understand, you want to purchase property, you want to create a program, create a service. Indigenous people are not going away. They have to be acknowledged. And the reality is, again, the federal government's responsible for Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. We're the fastest growing population. 55% of our population is under the age of 25. The federal government has a responsibility for us. We're at the negative end of every socioeconomic indicator. If you think your business is going to thrive or survive if Indigenous people are not brought in and made part of the economy, made part of the social, political, economical spheres within this country, then we have it costs $100,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. Foster parents get paid almost $3,000, $4,000 a month to look after Indigenous children. If our 55% of our population isn't educated and trained with new skills to be able to support their own family, we have the highest birth rate of any. The birth rate is declining in Canada, not in our population. So if we don't, as a society, work towards tapping this untapped resource, then Canada is not going to succeed, and your hopes and dreams of coming to Canada are not going to be successful either. And then you combine that with the baby boomers and the cost that they're respectfully, the cost that they are costing our economy. They've taken their knowledge out of the economy. They're not contributing to the economy. They're taking their pensions, taking their health care. And again, respectfully, they're entitled to all of that. But you combine those, and it's been labeled a demographic tsunami. So we all are vested in having every member of our society functioning, healthy, and happy. And all immigrants and settlement organizations really would do a disservice to all of their clients and all of their people if they didn't provide them with the true history of the land and the tools to survive in this economy.
OCM, so powerful. OCM, thank you. And I just want to share about what inclusiveness means. And I always use my own self as an example. I sat on an advisory committee for the multicultural kitchen program in Richmond. And one day the person who was facilitating it suddenly got ill, and nobody was there to stand in. So I said, well, I can do that, like for 1 or 2 times till you find someone. And so then it was like to welcome newcomers in to show different ways of cooking in Canada. And I was just really surprised that some of our folks from some countries never used ovens. And then I noticed that there was such a very variety of newcomers from many, many different nations. And so what we do is we talk about what do you want to make next time, and we'd all plan it and plan the menu and stuff. And then I noticed that people were very, very shy about trying to speak English. So what I gently did was I said, this is the time, this is a safe place, you can practice your English here in the kitchen. And I'm not saying this in a rough way, but everybody's here, let us all practice our English this time. And all the health nurses would come and visit because it's, how come you have so many people here? One time we had 32 women with 15 different languages in that kitchen. And we were welcomed by one of the churches who had a big commercial kitchen to operate in. And I wanted to share that, this is what's important is inclusiveness. What is important is showing how to navigate in a very, very strange world. And I want to show that what inclusiveness brings us together. And I was supposed to do it 2 times, and I did it like for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years or something like that. Anyway, I was blown away because what we'd do is we'd make the dish, and then at the lunchtime, every person from all these different nations would share how similar that dish was. When we made something that our Mexican sisters said, oh, we call that empanadas, or from Chile, I think it was. Actually, I think it was from Chile. And then, like, everybody would share a similar thing about how, you know, they made that in their country, and it was really practiced. And then, just before I left, because I got incredibly busy, one of the beautiful participants who came from, there was quite a group of Taiwan women came to support. She said, Roberta, when I was waiting to come to Canada, everybody told me, when you get to Canada, go see Roberta in the kitchen, and she will help you with your English and your cooking. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So inclusiveness, welcoming people, and creating an atmosphere where I always share with people who have immigrated to Canada, like Cory said, she would never go anywhere, and I feel the same way. We are so connected to the land. I would never want to live anywhere in the world but here. And I applaud people who come to this country under whatever conditions it is, whether it's by will or by force, that they are very, very, very brave to leave their land, their family, generations of loved ones, to this brand new country. I say they're brave because I would never do it. I would never go to any other country, and it's a lot of courage. And I hold my hands up. OCM, OCM.
Thank you so much. Well, I think that's a very good way to send us to food. And yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Javier. Sorry, just before we go to eat, I want to take a moment, sort of in response to Javier's question, but just to acknowledge the Indigenous women and the work that they have done to help newcomers and immigrants and refugees. Just in this circle alone, just in the last 2 hours, we've heard some really important stories of Indigenous women taking on that leadership role and helping, right? You know, from good place, from a good heart. So thank you, Cory, for the work that you're doing to translate all of the history of colonization into so many languages. There's such a deep respect and a deep, faith, right? That if people have access to this information, that something good will come of that, you know? So I raise my hands to you. Thank you. And to Elder Roberta, I mean, I just, I've had the good honor to sit in a lot of circles with Elder Roberta, and everything that, it never surprises me that in Taiwan you are famous for your cooking. I don't know how you do it, but it amazes me. So I just want to raise my hands and give good honor and Yawagoa great thanks to Elder Roberta for all the work that she does for our Indigenous people and for the people of Taiwan. And all of the women that you helped, over those many, many years. And I want to give good respect and good thanks to the stories that Charlene brought here today about the tireless, dedicated, really skilled work that her mother did as a Blackfoot matriarch, welcoming people to this land in a good way and ensuring that they were safe and that they were respected on Turtle Island. And that is the way of our people. As Indigenous people, we ensure that people are treated well here when they come to our territories. So thank you for upholding our traditions and being strong representatives of your territories, your nations, your people, and despite so many adversities, staying true to who you are as matriarch. So from my good heart, I raise my hands to each one of you and say, Nyawagoa, great thanks, all my relations.
Thank you so much. Yes. Yeah, so
So many times when I'm sharing out there, like what I've learned is to incorporate like goodness with, you know, hearing not so goodness things. And so I, myself and our elders, we create a lot of these little sacred bundles. So thank you, my dear, for helping me count. And so on our lunch break, what I'd like to offer is for something good for you to take away with you, a good memory of a gift. And I have carry with me the sacred plants. And thank you, Riel, for bringing the cedar. So in my bags, I have some sage, sweetgrass, a little bit of lavender, and of course these cedar boughs. So on the lunch break, we'll set them out if we can find them on a table somewhere down wherever we're going. If we could set them out, and then you can go help yourself. And for those of you who have made them before, so you just take a pinch of the sacred plants, think really good thoughts. Elder Fred John Statliam from our Lil'wat people taught me this many, many years ago. Think really good thoughts, or even say a little prayer as you're picking up the sacred plants and putting them in the cloth. And what Elder Fred taught us was that when you're putting those good thoughts and prayers into the cloth, and you can carry it with you wherever you go, keep it at your desk, maybe in your bag. Some people keep it in the car. Elder Fred says when you're having, you know, that crankiness, that sad feeling or whatever, Elder Fred says take out the sacred bundle. Breathe it in. And what the sacred plants, the power of the sacred plants is pushing away the negative and evil energy, just like I spoke about the cedar boughs. It will push away all the negativity, and then your thoughts will change up. So those teachings come from Elder Fred John. So I want to share that, and I want to share one with each and every one of you today. So when you're creating it too, like how I teach the little ones in the schools, when it's easier for them to do is once you put your little pinch of the sacred plants in, and you can help each other, put the opposite corners together like that and kind of fold it up so you're just making a little bundle. And then and you can help your neighbor too. If you have a hard time, because I've done it now thousands of times, I think, I am able to wrap it really fast, but people, it's awkward because it's hard to tie such a little. So help your neighbors. So maybe you can hold it while your neighbor ties it. So that's my gift to everyone today, to take away some goodness and good feelings with you when you go. So Haichka Siem. Thank you.
well, thank you again for your generosity. Oh, Charlene, of course.
I'd just like to thank Amsa for the invitation to be here. I'd like to thank everyone for being so present with your open minds and your open hearts and your good hearts. And I'd like to say, Elder Roberta, I do eat fish and chips. And many Blackfoot elders have been known to sneak salmon into their kitchens. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Javier. Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Okay, well, thank you for your generosity in the presence. We also have a small token of appreciation for our panelists. But very quickly now, we're gonna move downstairs. And there's going to be some brunch there, so help yourselves. But also, what we're going to do is like some self-facilitated table discussions as you eat, and you will see the instructions on the table. There's three envelopes in a big envelope, and there's 3 questions. Please open them one by one. So open one and discuss it because they all build on each other. And you can read what it says there, but I want to just read this part because I think it's very important with what our panelists have shared so graciously today. So please be mindful of everyone's space and participation, respectful of different opinions, and understanding of emotional responses that might arise. Be a good speaker and a better listener. Contribute to making this a safe environment for everyone, And always remember, this is about sharing and learning. It's not a right or wrong type of discussion. So we will resume here one. I will get the final remarks if we... Yeah, I think because we will put together, because there's another thing very quickly also, we're opening a list for organizations and people in organizations that are interested in maybe forming a working group that is going to explore and design initiatives within this framework that we are setting up today. So we will go deeper on the things that we've been talking about. And it's a work, it's a long-term work, and we are actually following up on this symposium with another project. But we would like to invite people that are interested in actually making action out of this framework. And I know for a lot of people here it's a bit of a shift of the way we think about getting about this, but if there's interest, at the registration table, there's a list, put down your names and we will connect with you. And then we would like to have 10 minutes, and I know we said 1, but maybe if you can stay 10, 15 minutes after 1, then we can come back here at 1 after lunch and the work, and then put together the 2 or 3 main ideas that can start framing this approach. So, bon appetit, and see you downstairs. And please, thank you again, Elder, for your presence, and everybody, please take some good out of it.